Welcome. Today we're going to look at content in HTML and the hows and whys of putting content on the page with the most common HTML elements. I've titled it Everything is a Box because, as we will see, all HTML elements are kind of like boxes we're making to hold our content. So, you could also say that everything is in a box because HTML elements can hold other HTML elements. Let's look at a website to see what I mean by all of the content on a web page is in a box. This is the site for We Heart, an online web magazine. Each area of content on the page is an HTML element that essentially makes a box around the content. Even if you can't see it, the box is there. This is what the page looks like when we turn on the outlines of all those containing boxes for HTML elements. As you can see, each piece of content has a box around it. So, you have to promise not to tell anyone, but my mother-in-law has a bit of an obsession about organizing things. When she cleans, she likes to put everything in boxes and sometimes boxes in boxes. This weekend, she brought these organizers to our house and organized this drawer. As a web designer, you need to channel your inner mother-in-law a bit and want to have the proper box for all of your content and, yes, even put boxes in boxes sometimes. So how do we make boxes? That is through HTML elements. Here's some content inside of a div element. Most elements on the page have an opening tag and a closing tag that are put at the beginning and end of the content you want to be in the element. This is also called wrapping the content with tags. There are a few elements that have no closing tag. So while everything is a box, you also want to put everything in the same box, even if the box is a nice one. Of course, you also don't want to put nothing in a box, right? Because that's also a little bit hard to find and hard to make things organized. The other thing is you don't want to put things in the wrong box, right? Like putting garbage in the recycling box or paper in the glass box. So what you want is to have each different type of content in the box that's appropriate for that content. The name for that is semantic markup. And it's just a fancy way of saying the right content is in the right box. When we have semantic markup, it means that all of our content is in the right box. You have matched the meaning of the content with a type of HTML element that's supposed to hold that content. One way to think about this is kind of like setting the table for dinner. If you just threw all your food on the table or put liquids in a plate or salad in a cup, it wouldn't be a great dining experience. Right? Learning to set the table, put the right content to the right kind of container is an important part of being able to eat, and doing that with HTML and elements is an important part of becoming a web designer. So there are three basic types of elements that deal with content. Text is the most common type of element because most things on the web are text. Media allows you to add images and sound and video to the page, and structure groups pieces of content together for things like navigation, headers, footers, and page sections. So first we're going to look at some of the most common elements for text. So the three most common types are headings, paragraphs, and lists. Headings are what they sound like. They're headings for areas of content. Paragraphs are kind of your default element for just general text, and lists store ordered lists of information. There are 6 different content headings, and they go in order of importance, with H1 being the most important and H6 being the least important. So if 2 headings have the same level of importance, they should probably get the same heading tag. And we're going to look at this web page to see how they might be applied. So all of these that have been highlighted here are headings. This is from a Book Apart website. And here we see some possible heading elements that you could add for these different parts of the page. Okay, so we're moving on to paragraphs. So most of the text on the page is going to be in a paragraph. It's sort of your default element if you're going to put text on. So we're going to see here that all these are paragraphs on this page. Let's move on to ordered lists. So lists let us store information, ordered information, and this one is a common use of a list to store text, and that's how we're sort of dealing with now as text, but you should know you can put more than text in a list. For example, most websites, their navigation, the items in the navigation are made up of list elements, which is usually text, but you could also put a series of images in list items or whatever. So the ordered list is called an ordered list because it gives you numbers when they are shown. Right? So on the left there's the HTML, on the right is what you would see. And the OL element tags denote that it's going to be an ordered list. So that's what the OL is for. And then inside of the OL tags, the first elements inside of them can only be list item elements, or LI. Inside the list items, you can put kind of whatever you want. Well, not quite whatever you want, but a lot of different content. And whether they're 1, 2, 3, 4, A, B, C, D, or Roman numerals, that's part of the styling. By default, all browsers render them as 1, 2, 3, 4, but you can use CSS to make it render as a different kind of ordering, like the alphabet or Roman numerals. This is an unordered list. So it's very similar to an ordered list, except in that it doesn't have an order, right? There is no visible order. You just see there on the right, you have the bullet points, which is the default way it's shown. You use the UL tags, UL for unordered list, to make the unordered list. And this, when I mention navigation, usually this is the kind of list you would use when you do the navigation for your site. Again, the list item elements are inside of the UL, and then you can put whatever content you want inside the list item elements. So let's look at this page here. This article is sort of nice because it shows examples of headings and paragraphs and lists all on a page. And this is a sort of typical page. You have a heading, you have some paragraphs, you have a list or two, and that is most of the text that you do is going to be one of these things. And it also includes some inline markup, which we're going to cover next to do those emphasized elements there that I've just highlighted. Inline, what does that mean and what is block? So inline versus block elements. So elements that show content are mostly either inline elements or block elements. They have different default behavior, inline and block, in the way that the browser displays them, and you can change this behavior with CSS, but we're going to focus on the default behavior today. So let's look at block elements first. By default, block elements stack on top of each other. So if you put 4 block elements in your HTML, they will display like this, one on top of each other on the web page. Inline elements, however, default by chaining next to each other. So if there's room right next to an inline element, the next one will go to the right of it and so forth. It'll go the other way, by the way. If you're using right to left text, you can have it go the other way. But by default in the browsers, they chain to the right, and then when they hit the edge, the block will wrap under it, which is what we see here with block 7, right? It went to the edge of the page, it didn't have room, and so it moved down below the blocks that were before it. And here's a web page with the block elements outlined in red and the inline elements outlined in blue. So let's look at some of the most common inline elements. They are the anchor tag, which makes links, the B, strong, and I and M elements. I'm going to give you more of their official names for them in a second. This is an anchor element, and it allows you to link other HTML pages or files on a server. And they're also often called hyperlinks as well. And the href part of it is where the link is going to go, and then what's inside the opening and closing anchor tags are what is shown on the page. Also, browsers by the default put an underline in a different color, which is normally blue, color for the link. So people often call it the B element, but it's technically, I believe now, the bring attention to element. And the strong importance element have the same default look, right? They make things bold. But you can also, by the way, make all these things look different in CSS. But the browsers by default make them bold. Technically, the strong element should be used to indicate content that has special importance, while the B, or bring attention to element, is just to bring people's attention to the text. And the text doesn't have any special importance. Some people argue about the semantic difference, and others just kind of use them how they see fit. There's a couple things I'd like you to keep in mind with these, and also on the next two that I'm going to show you. One is to be consistent with your use. So if you're using one of them in a certain way and you come up with that same use case again, use the same element. Don't flip back and forth between them just kind of randomly. It not only is just not great consistency, but also it makes it really hard to style with your CSS, because then you have to remember to style both of them. The other second thing is to pay attention to what conventions are used when you're doing work on a team, especially if you're doing professional work and you're new to a team. So they may have rules about how they interpret these and when they use them or don't use them. And so you want to make sure that you pay attention to those. These two are the idiomatic text, or I element, and the emphasis element. And EM, they have also the same default look in that most browsers will italicize the content that's inside of them. They also have different meanings, like the previous pair that we did. The M emphasis element marks words that have stress emphasis. So this is something that you do when you're speaking, right? So instead of saying, I really want to go on vacation, you might say, I really want to go on vacation. So that really, you could put the EM around it to show that it was emphasized. The I, or idiomatic text element, is used to just set some text off from other text for some reason. Like you might be writing a technical term or someone's thoughts, like John thought, I want to go to the store. So I want to go to the store, you could put in the I element. And also sometimes things like names of ships and things like that. All right, and of course you can use CSS to style them differently than being italicized as well. So some general rules here to reiterate. Use the strong element to indicate importance or seriousness or urgency of something. The bring attention to element to bring attention to words that don't have any special importance, but you just want to bring people's attention to them. The emphasis element to indicate stress emphasis, things that are really important, right, or just emphasized more than others. And the idiomatic text element to set off text from normal text, like alternative voice, technical terms, thoughts, things like that. It does take a while to get used to doing these things, and you will see all the time, everywhere, many websites that don't really follow these rules correctly or strictly. Okay, now the second type we're going to do is media. So we're going to look at the again, the basic media elements, not all of them, but the most common ones. So there are three common types: images, video, and audio. There's other types of media you can put on web pages, but these are by far the most common. If you click on the media elements, go on Mozilla Developer Network, you can find some of the other types. Image is probably the most common, and it points to a separate image file. And the src attribute in there tells you where that image is stored. And the alt attribute allows someone who is visually impaired or blind to have that read to them so that they know what the image was. So because of this, for accessibility reasons, all of your images should have that alt attribute, unless that image is just purely visually aesthetic and has no meaning on the page. So maybe like a texture that you're putting on a background behind something, that's just a visual texture, for example. We didn't talk about it before, but attributes all have the same basic way of doing how they do. So we'll look at here. So they have a name of the attribute that goes there, and then next is the equals sign, then you have a quote and a closing quote, and inside of that is the value of the attribute. Those things make up HTML attributes. There are a few, and we'll see one actually later, where you just use the attribute name, and that's it. That's all you need. But for most of them, they need a name, and then they have a value. So name equals, and then value in double quotes. Let's look at an example. So here we have just a normal web page, and there are 2 images on it, and so those would be where our image elements are. The other thing to remember is that the image element points to that separate file, right? So the HTML page is loaded first, and then it looks at the image element, sees it needs an image, and then loads the image from there. Okay, so an audio element, sort of similar to an image file, points to a separate audio file. And it has also the source attribute here, right? And that points you to where that file is. This is the one I was telling you about before. This controls attribute shows the controls, which is usually something that you want to do. And then also there's another piece here that the content inside the audio element you don't see unless for some reason your browser can't play that audio, and then it will show that text if the browser can't play it. Otherwise it will show the controls for the audio and let people play it. Video is similar to audio, but there are some differences. One of the similarities we can see is that it also has the controls attribute. We has here a width attribute, so that's telling you how wide it's going to be. And then we have here a couple different sources. So different browsers have different abilities to play video files. So often what you need to do is make different versions of your file for different browsers, right? So this is in a WebM format, this is in an MP4 format, and this here tells it what type of format it is. So the source element goes inside of the video. It says, oh, here's a video source. It has a source attribute, which like in images and so forth, points to where the file is and has the type. And then you can put as many as you need to in here, however many files you have, and the browser will pick one and then play that if it can play any of them. If it can't play any of those files, then it will show this text that it has down here at the end. I should say, as a note, this is not how you embed video from a site like YouTube. That's different, and it's a different process that I'm not going to show here. But just to know, this is how you would play a video where you have the video file on your site. If you want to play it from another site like Vimeo or YouTube, it's a different method, and it's a slightly different process you have to do to stream that video in. Okay, so the third type we're going to do is page structure elements. Now, technically, they're usually more formally known as content sectioning elements, and they're linked there to Mozilla Developer Network reference on them. And another way I like to think about these is as grouping elements, right? These elements have other elements inside of them, and so they kind of group content on your page, and they do it also in a semantic way, right? In a meaningful way. Different types of groups of elements have different ways to get put in, whether it's a heading or an article or a section, and things we'll talk about in a second. So let's go back for a second to the image I had of the organized utensil drawer, right? So in this image, we're going to look at the wooden dividers there to represent the content sectioning elements. So they create the structure for the page inside of which all the content goes, right? This is the other reason I refer to them as grouping elements or page structure elements, right? The official name before was content sectioning. But essentially, these are often some of the first elements you want to think about when you're making your site. So often we learn from the other way around, right? We learn about the paragraphs and those kind of things I went over earlier. But when you're starting a website and you draw out, let's say, a wireframe or something about how you want your site to go, these are the first elements you kind of want to think about, because you're essentially doing the structure of your page about where are things going to go. All right, so let's look at what they are. These are the most common elements you use to group content on a page. Now, technically, number 8 there, the div is not a content sectioning element, but it is used by so many people that I'm adding it here because you're going to see it in that way. And you should really learn the semantics of these, meaning each of these has a certain type of content that is supposed to go inside of it. Whereas div doesn't have any semantics. It doesn't really have anything that's supposed to go inside of it. The article there, Stop Using So Many Divs, is a good one to take a look at because it talks about how divs are misused and about how some of these elements should be used as well, which I'll go over briefly, but there's a little more detail in that article if you want it. What we see here is a typical HTML5 page structure. Right? So there's an overall page header here that lists some header, and we have a navigation, which usually doesn't have to be, but is often inside of that header. Then we have our main element, so that's the main content of the page that goes inside of there. And after that, the footer element, which contains our footer. And then inside of main, there's a couple of common elements, other sectioning elements that would go inside. So this one is an article, right? That's like an entire section of content. You can have more than one article on a page, by the way. There could be 2, 3, 4 more of these. Then there's a side here that has content that isn't as important to the main content and can be kind of thought of like, I don't know, a footnote or other things like that, or maybe a sidebar on a website and things like that. So this is a typical sort of way that a page is set up. And what I want to actually do is go here to this next one and show that as you might see it in a code editor. So this is sort of the full page, right? We have our doc type here to say it's HTML. We have the HTML element, which starts there and ends down here. So that's the whole page. Then you have your head and body elements here, right? Which we haven't talked about the head element today, but that talks about what kind of content is on the page and some other meta information. What we've been talking about today is content in HTML. So it's all inside the body. So the body is where all visible content goes on the page. And then here is what we just saw on the previous page. Header at the top with the nav, then the main with an article on a side, right? Other elements could go in here too, section and all that, so forth. And then the footer at the bottom. So this is, if you're not sure how to organize your page or you need something to get started, this is a great sort of boilerplate type of thing to get started when you're going from a blank page. Okay, so let's go back to that site that we looked at earlier. And we want to see how we might apply some of those page structure elements to this site. All right, so here is the site. And now here it is where I have outlined some of the page structure parts on the page. And then we want to take a look at some of the labels here. I've labeled some of the sectioning elements, right? So we have the header at the top, then main, then inside of main, these are different sections. So you have those 3 sections. And then inside of the sections, we have articles to represent each of those actual, in this case, it's a magazine. So those are each articles. Then there's the nav that's in the header and also an aside there for the social media links as well. This isn't exactly how they did it per se, but this is how you might do it if you're looking at it. Okay, well, that's the end. Thank you for watching this. I hope you learned some more about HTML elements and how they define content on a web page.